The swift current of the Verde River surged with unnatural force that spring afternoon in 1878, carrying away not just debris, but the desperate screams of Faith Jenkins as she watched her 4-year-old daughter disappear beneath the churning waters. Faith had only looked away for a moment while washing clothes along the riverbank outside the small Arizona Territory settlement of Cottonwood. Emma, Emma. Faith's voice tore through the air, her slender frame already splashing into the dangerous waters, her long skirt instantly becoming a sodden weight threatening to drag her under as well. Ezra Xavier heard the screams from where he'd been watering his horse 20 yards upstream. Without hesitation, the cowboy kicked off his boots and dove into the rushing waters, his powerful arms cutting through the current as he spotted the small form being swept downstream. "Hold on, madam! I'm going after her!" he shouted, though he doubted Faith could hear him over her own frantic cries and the roar of the water. The spring melt from the mountains had turned the normally placid Verde into a raging beast, swollen and hungry for anything in its path. Ezra's lungs burned as he pushed through the current, keeping his eyes fixed on the flash of Emma's blue dress ahead. The girl had stopped screaming, which terrified him more than her cries had. With one final surge, he managed to reach the child just as she began to sink beneath the surface. His hand caught her dress, pulling her to him as he fought to keep both their heads above water. "I've got her," he shouted to Faith, who was struggling through the shallower waters near the bank, trying desperately to follow. But the current was merciless, and Ezra could see Faith being pulled deeper into the river herself, her face a mask of determination mixed with terror. Making a split-second decision, Ezra angled himself toward Faith, clutching Emma tightly to his chest with one arm while stretching out his other toward the child's mother. Their hands connected for a brief moment before the current tried to tear them apart again. "Grab onto me," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Faith's fingers clamped around his wrist with surprising strength, and Ezra found himself now fighting to keep all three of them afloat as the river carried them downstream. With Emma secured against his chest and Faith clinging to his arm, Ezra turned himself perpendicular to the current, using his legs to kick them slowly toward the riverbank. His muscles screamed in protest, but the sight of a low-hanging tree branch ahead gave him renewed determination. "When I say now, grab that branch," he shouted to Faith, positioning them as best he could. As they approached the lifeline, he gave the command, "Now." Faith's fingers closed around the branch with desperate strength. Ezra used the momentary anchor to swing Emma and himself closer to the shore, finally feeling his boots touch the riverbed. With one final surge, he pushed them all into the shallows, collapsing onto the muddy bank with Emma still clutched protectively against him, and Faith falling beside them, all three gasping for breath. Emma began to cough, water spilling from her mouth as she started to cry. Faith immediately gathered her daughter into her arms, sobbing with relief as she checked her for injuries. "She's breathing," Faith managed between her own coughs, her voice raw. "She's breathing." Ezra lay on his back, chest heaving, staring up at the clear blue Arizona sky. "Thank God," was all he could say, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body, leaving him shaking. After several minutes of recovery, Faith turned to her rescuer. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet tangles around her face, but Ezra thought he'd never seen anyone so beautiful, her blue eyes shining with tears of gratitude, her daughter safely in her arms. "You saved us," Faith said simply, her voice breaking. "You saved my Emma. I don't even know your name, sir." Ezra sat up, running a hand through his soaked dark hair. "Ezra Xavier, madam. Just passing through on my way to Prescott." "Faith Jenkins," she replied, still clutching Emma to her chest. "And this is Emma. We owe you our lives, Mr. Xavier." Ezra waved away her thanks, suddenly embarrassed by the intensity of her gratitude. "Any man would have done the same," he said, though they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. Not everyone would have risked their life against such a current. "We need to get you both warm and dry," he said practically, noticing the way little Emma had begun to shiver. Is your home nearby? Faith nodded, pointing to a small cabin visible through the trees about a quarter-mile from the river. Just over there. My husband. She paused, a shadow crossing her face. My late husband built it 2 years ago, before the fever took him last winter. Ezra's expression softened at this revelation. A young widow with a small child, alone in this harsh territory. Such stories were all too common in the West. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Jenkins. Faith, please, she insisted, struggling to stand with Emma still in her arms. Ezra rose quickly, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. Let me carry her, he offered, and after a moment's hesitation, Faith allowed him to take Emma. The little girl's arms wound around his neck trustingly, her small body still trembling. The walk to the cabin was slow, all three of them waterlogged and exhausted. As they approached, Ezra noted the well-maintained garden and the sturdy construction of the small home. Faith Jenkins might be alone, but she was clearly a woman of determination. I'll get a fire going, Ezra said once they were inside. He set Emma down gently on a chair near the hearth and immediately went to work, finding kindling and logs neatly stacked beside the fireplace. Within minutes, a warm blaze was crackling, pushing back the chill that had settled into their bones. Faith had changed Emma into dry clothes and now wrapped her in a quilt before turning to Ezra. Your clothes need drying too, she said practically. I have some of Henry's things that might fit you. They're not much, but they're dry. Ezra accepted her offer gratefully, changing in the small side room she indicated while Faith prepared hot tea. When he emerged in the late Henry Jenkins's shirt and trousers, slightly short in the sleeves and legs, but otherwise a reasonable fit, Faith had Emma sipping broth at the table and a change of clothes for herself as well. I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Xavier, Faith said as she handed him a steaming cup of tea. Ezra, please, he replied with a small smile. And no thanks necessary. I'm just glad I was there. Emma looked up at him with wide, solemn eyes. You swimmed good, she said seriously, causing both adults to laugh, breaking the tension. Well, thank you, Miss Emma, Ezra replied with a tip of an imaginary hat. I learned from the best the fish themselves. Emma giggled, and Ezra felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the sound. He'd been drifting for so long after the war, taking work where he could find it, never staying in one place longer than it took to earn enough money to move on. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard a child laugh or sat at a family table, however modest. Will you stay for supper? Faith asked hesitantly. It's the least I can offer, and your clothes won't be dry until morning. Ezra knew he should refuse. The proper thing would be to retrieve his horse, find his bedroll, and make camp elsewhere, not impose on a widow's hospitality. But the thought of riding away from this small cabin, leaving Faith and Emma alone after their ordeal, didn't sit right with him. I'd be honored, he said finally, but only if you'll allow me to contribute. I have some jerky and coffee in my saddlebags, and I should check on my horse besides. Faith nodded. Emma and I will be fine for a few minutes. Your horse is likely still by the river where you left him. Ezra found his gelding, Thunder, exactly where he'd expected, still calmly grazing near where he'd left him. The loyal animal had waited patiently, seemingly unfazed by his master's unexpected swim. After retrieving his saddlebags and securing Thunder to a post outside Faith's cabin, Ezra returned to find Faith and Emma setting the small table. The simple meal of rabbit stew, enhanced with Ezra's jerky, was one of the most satisfying he'd had in months. The conversation flowed easily as Faith explained how she'd come to Arizona Territory with her husband 3 years earlier, drawn by the promise of land and a fresh start after the hard years following the war. Henry was from Georgia originally, she explained, her voice soft with memory. After losing everything, he couldn't bear to stay. He'd heard that the Verde Valley was fertile, that a man could make a life here. Ezra nodded in understanding. Many came west for the same reason. The war left little behind for some. You fought? Faith asked, noticing the way his hand unconsciously moved to his left side where she guessed an old wound might lie. Union cavalry, Ezra confirmed, though that seems a lifetime ago now. Faith studied him thoughtfully. And now you drift? I find work where I can, he said simply. Ranch hand, cattle driver, occasional scout. I was heading to Prescott to see about work with the Army again as a scout. Emma had fallen asleep at the table, her head resting on her arms. Faith gently lifted her and carried her to the small bed in the corner of the cabin. Ezra watched the tender way she tucked her daughter in, smoothing back her still damp blonde curls. When Faith returned to the table, she looked exhausted, but determined. I've been managing on my own since Henry died, she said quietly. The garden provides most of what we need, and I sell eggs and milk in town. But it's not easy. Ezra listened, recognizing the pride beneath her words. This was not a woman asking for charity or even assistance. She was simply stating facts. A friend in town, Mrs. Hollister, watches Emma when I need to make deliveries, Faith continued. But today she was ill, so Emma came with me to the river. Her voice caught. I only looked away for a moment to wring out a sheet. Children move quickly, Ezra said gently, and that river is running higher and faster than usual with the spring melt. Faith's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. If you hadn't been there. But I was, Ezra interrupted firmly, and you both are safe. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling and Emma's soft breathing the only sounds in the small cabin. Ezra found himself studying Faith's profile in the firelight, the determined set of her jaw, the gentle curve of her lips, the stray tendril of honey blonde hair that had escaped her hasty braid. I should let you rest, he said finally, breaking the silence. It's been a trying day. Faith looked up, something like disappointment flashing in her eyes before she masked it. Of course, you can take Henry's bedroll by the fire. It's not much, but it's better than the ground. Ezra accepted gratefully, and soon the cabin was dark except for the dying embers of the fire. But sleep eluded him as he listened to Faith's soft breathing from the bed she shared with Emma. His mind kept returning to the moment in the river when he'd held both mother and child against the current, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the small windows of the cabin. Ezra woke to find Faith already up and moving quietly about the kitchen area, preparing a simple breakfast while Emma still slept. Good morning, she whispered when she noticed him sitting up. I hope you slept well. Better than I have in months, Ezra admitted truthfully. There was something about the solid roof overhead and the knowledge that he wasn't alone that had allowed him deeper rest than his usual light sleep on the trail. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with a precious spoonful of honey, Ezra retrieved his now dry clothes and changed back into them, reluctantly preparing to leave. He had a job waiting in Prescott after all, and he'd already imposed on Faith's hospitality longer than propriety allowed. I should be on my way, he said as he folded Henry's borrowed clothes neatly and placed them on the table. Thank you for your kindness. Faith looked up from where she was helping Emma button her dress. Will you be coming back through Cottonwood on your return journey? The question took Ezra by surprise. I hadn't thought that far ahead, he admitted. My plans aren't usually that fixed. If you do, Faith said carefully, not quite meeting his eyes, you would be welcome to stop here, for a proper meal at least, as thanks. Ezra felt an unexpected surge of warmth at her invitation. That's very kind, he said, suddenly reluctant to mount up and ride away from this small cabin and its occupants. Emma tugged at his pant leg, looking up at him with wide blue eyes so like her mother's. Will you come back and tell me more about the fishes that teached you to swim? Ezra crouched down to her level, unable to resist her earnest question. Would you like that, Miss Emma? She nodded solemnly. And maybe you could teach me to swim too, so I don't get carried away again. Ezra glanced up at Faith, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of emotions playing across her face. "That would be up to your mama," he said gently. "It would be a useful skill," Faith acknowledged, "especially living so near the river." The decision formed in Ezra's mind almost without conscious thought. "I'll be back in 3 weeks' time," he said, standing. "The scout work in Prescott shouldn't take longer than that. When I return, perhaps we could arrange some swimming lessons in a calmer part of the river." The smile that lit Faith's face made something twist in Ezra's chest. "We'll look forward to it," she said simply. As Ezra mounted Thunder and rode away from the small cabin, he found himself already counting the days until his return, a sensation entirely foreign to a man who had drifted aimlessly for so long. The 3 weeks in Prescott passed slowly for Ezra. The scout work was straightforward enough, guiding a group of Army surveyors through the territory, helping them map water sources and passages suitable for moving troops if needed. But his thoughts kept returning to the small cabin by the Verde River, to Faith's quiet strength and Emma's trusting smile. For Faith, the weeks passed in their usual rhythm of chores and errands, but she found herself watching the trail more often than she cared to admit. Emma asked about Mr. Ezra nearly every day, wanting to know when her swimming lessons would begin. Faith tried to temper her daughter's expectations. Men like Ezra Xavier were drifters by nature, and promises made in the moment often faded with distance and time. Yet, on the afternoon of the 22nd day since he'd ridden out, Ezra appeared on the trail leading to their cabin, his tall form unmistakable even at a distance. Emma spotted him first, her delighted shout bringing Faith running from the chicken coop. "He came back, Mama! He came back!" Emma danced with excitement, her earlier near tragedy in the river seemingly forgotten in childish joy. Faith felt her heart quicken as she watched Ezra approach, his face breaking into a warm smile when he saw them waiting. He looked different somehow, his dark beard trimmed neater than before, his clothes less trail-worn. "Mrs. Jenkins," he called as he drew closer. "Miss Emma, I hope I'm still welcome." "You remembered," Faith said, unable to keep the pleased surprise from her voice. Ezra dismounted, reaching into his saddlebag to produce a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For the young lady," he said, handing it to Emma. "A proper swimming outfit from Prescott." Emma tore open the package to find a simple but well-made swimming costume, a modified dress design that wouldn't weigh her down in the water. "Can I try it now?" she asked eagerly. Faith laughed, the sound freer than Ezra remembered. "Not today, sweetheart. It's already too late in the afternoon. But perhaps tomorrow, if Mr. Xavier is staying that long." Ezra's expression grew more serious. "Actually, Mrs. Jenkins, Faith, I was hoping to speak with you about that." He glanced meaningfully at Emma, indicating he wanted a private conversation. Faith nodded, understanding. "Emma, why don't you take your new swimming costume inside and show it to your doll? I'll be in shortly." Once Emma had skipped inside, Faith turned to Ezra, noting the nervous way he shifted his weight. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing wrong," he assured her quickly. "It's just that my time in Prescott gave me opportunity to think about my life, my wandering, about what I might be looking for." Faith waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I've accepted a position at the Monroe Ranch just outside Cottonwood," Ezra continued, "as foreman. It's steady work, good pay, a permanent position." "You're staying in Cottonwood?" Faith couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Ezra nodded, meeting her eyes directly now. "If that's agreeable to you and Emma." Faith's heart pounded in her chest, understanding the unspoken question beneath his words. "We would be very glad to have you nearby," she said carefully. "I've been adrift since the war," Ezra admitted, "taking work where I could find it, never putting down roots. But when I pulled you and Emma from that river," he paused, searching for the right words. "For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be." Faith's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Ezra, we've only just met." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'm not asking for anything except the chance to know you better, both of you. to see if what I felt that day on the river might grow into something more substantial. Faith considered his words carefully. She was not a woman who made rash decisions, especially not with her daughter's well-being at stake. Yet there was something about Ezra Xavier that spoke to her, his quiet strength, his gentle way with Emma, the respect he'd shown for her independence. "Emma needs those swimming lessons," she said finally, a small smile playing at her lips. "And I suppose having someone to help with the heavier chores around the place wouldn't be unwelcome." The relief that washed over Ezra's face was almost comical. "I'm handy with repairs," he offered eagerly, "and I noticed your corral fence could use some reinforcement." Faith laughed softly. "Are you critiquing my carpentry skills, Mr. Xavier?" "Never," he said with mock seriousness, "merely offering my services, Mrs. Jenkins." Over the weeks that followed, Ezra became a regular visitor at the Jenkins cabin. True to his word, he taught Emma to swim in a gentle eddy of the river, well away from the main current. Faith watched from the bank, her heart in her throat at first, but gradually relaxing as she saw her daughter's growing confidence in the water under Ezra's patient instruction. "She's a natural," Ezra told Faith one afternoon as Emma practiced her floating nearby, the special swimming costume allowing her movement without dangerous drag. "Fearless, like her mother." Faith raised an eyebrow. "I'm hardly fearless." "You dove into that river after Emma without hesitation," Ezra pointed out. "Many would have run along the bank screaming instead of plunging in." "Any mother would have done the same," Faith said, echoing Ezra's earlier dismissal of his own heroism. "Perhaps," he conceded, "but not everyone faces life's challenges with the grace you've shown, Faith." The compliment warmed her cheeks and she looked away, watching Emma splash happily in the shallows. "Life doesn't give us much choice but to move forward." "No, but it does give us choices in how we do so," Ezra said quietly, "and who we bring along for the journey." Their eyes met, and Faith felt the subtle shift between them, the acknowledgement of growing feelings neither had yet put into words. Summer turned to autumn, and Ezra's visits became longer and more frequent. His position at the Monroe Ranch gave him certain liberties as foreman, and he often completed his work early to spend evenings at the Jenkins cabin. He repaired the roof before the winter rains, reinforced the corral, and built a proper smokehouse for preserving meat. Emma adored him, following him around like a shadow whenever he visited, soaking up his stories of places he'd been and people he'd met in his travels. Faith watched their growing bond with a mixture of joy and trepidation, joy at seeing her daughter so happy, trepidation at how deeply entwined their lives were becoming with this man who had once been a drifter. The first snowfall of winter came early that year, dusting the Verde Valley with white in mid-November. Ezra arrived at the cabin just as the flakes began to fall, carrying supplies from town and a small package wrapped in colorful paper. "An early Christmas gift," he explained, handing it to Faith after Emma had gone to bed. "Though I hope you'll consider it more of a question." Puzzled, Faith carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully carved with river motifs flowing water, reeds, and small fish hidden among the designs. Inside lay a simple silver ring set with a single small turquoise stone. "It's not much," Ezra said quietly, watching her face. "Not what you deserve. But it's a promise. If you'll have it. A promise that I'll never drift away again, that I'll always be there to hold you against whatever currents life brings." Faith looked up, her eyes shining. "Are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Faith Jenkins," Ezra said, taking her hands in his. "If you'll let me be a father to Emma, a husband to you. If you'll build a life with me right here, where fate brought us together." Faith's mind flashed back to that terrifying day in the river, the fear, the desperation, but also the moment when Ezra's strong arms had encircled both her and Emma, holding them safe against the raging current. How that moment had changed everything. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "Yes, Ezra Xavier, I will marry you." They were wed the following spring, when the Verde River had once again swollen with melting snow from the mountains. The whole town of Cottonwood turned out for the celebration, curious to witness the union of the widow Jenkins and the former drifter who'd become the respected foreman of Monroe Ranch. Emma, now 5, served as flower girl, proudly scattering petals before her mother as Faith walked toward Ezra, who waited beneath an arch of early wildflowers with Reverend Thompson. "Who gives this woman?" the Reverend asked, following tradition. "I do," Emma answered before anyone else could speak, causing a ripple of laughter through the gathering. "And me too." Ezra crouched down to Emma's level, his expression serious. "I'm very grateful, Miss Emma. I promise to take very good care of both of you." The vows were simple but heartfelt. Two people who had found each other through chance and courage, pledging to face life's currents together. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife, Ezra kissed Faith with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future secured. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep in her new bedroom in their expanded cabin, the first project Ezra had undertaken after their engagement, husband and wife sat on the porch, listening to the distant sound of the river that had brought them together. "Do you ever miss it?" Faith asked softly. "The drifting, the freedom of the open trail." Ezra considered the question seriously, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. "I thought I might," he admitted, "after so many years of answering to no one but myself. But then I realized something." "What's that?" Faith asked, leaning into his warmth. "I wasn't free," Ezra said simply. "I was running, from memories, from connection, from the possibility of loss. The war took so much from me, friends, family, my sense of purpose. I convinced myself that moving on was freedom, but it was really just fear." Faith nodded, understanding. She had faced her own fears after Henry's death, fear of failure, of not being able to provide for Emma, of facing life alone. "The day I jumped into that river," Ezra continued, "was the first time in years I'd moved toward something instead of away from it." He squeezed her shoulders gently. "And I've been swimming toward you and Emma ever since." Faith smiled, turning her face up to his. "Well, Cowboy, I'd say you've made it to shore." "The best kind of dry land," Ezra agreed, kissing her softly. Inside the cabin, Emma stirred in her sleep. Safe and secure in the home her parents were building. Together, a home born from courage, strengthened by shared purpose, and filled with a love as enduring as the river that flowed nearby, constantly moving yet always present, powerful in its steadfastness. As spring turned to summer again, Faith found herself once more at the river's edge, though this time she watched from a safe distance as Ezra taught a group of local children to swim, Emma proudly demonstrating her floating technique to the novices. Faith's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where their next child grew a new life, born from the love that had sparked in a moment of danger and courage on these very banks. The river that had nearly taken everything from her had in the end given her everything instead, a second chance, a new love, and a family made stronger by the currents they had faced together.